Three, two, one. We are going live. Okay, here goes. Streaming. Setting up your meeting. Redirecting to YouTube. Okay,
Three, two, one. We are going live.
There it is. Okay, the window's open. We just went live. Okay, so now we click record over here. Bear with me one more minute. Why did they hide the record button here? Record on this computer. Okay, good. Three, two, one. Hello, everybody. We are back at FractalU.com. Welcome, boys and girls, children all over the world. Tufan is here with us, and Terry Burns is here with us, and lots of old friends. Dan Mack is here, Jenny is here, and Patrick, and Jane from Finhorn. It's all cool. And many friends, and Dr. Shelley from Calgary, theshareablewave.com, Shelley. And Shelley is helping to test our gorgeous new super fun magic toy, piezofire.com, with some fun results reports. And that product launch is in a few weeks when Patrick finishes the audio files, and when he's speaking at Fractal U here, we will be doing a major launch of piezofire.com. And so you can actually run it from the implosive harmonics of Flame and Vine, Flame and Sound, or from separate audio files. So we're preparing a lovely, fun evening tonight. Terry Burns is an amazing expert on the historical nature of alchemy, John Dee and Kelly. In fact, Terry knows more about Kelly and Dee than most anybody on planet Earth, not to mention Flamel and whatever. And this is going to be a fun talk. But Tufan, we had a few other announcements. Was that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
We need to announce the next following two lectures plus the last two lectures which we recently added to our program. Would you like to go ahead and announce that, or would you like me to?
Well, if you got the
So next week we are going to do our lecture with Ralph Otterpol about fine-tuning ourselves with the nature, conscious harmony with the land, start your own fieldwork of conscious perception and restoration of the living plasma lines of the land. Restoring soils on all levels will create natural abundance of water, food, and balanced weather conditions. Humans and nature co-develop to their enormous potentials, learn it, do it, alone or with friends, teach it, and raise happiness levels in your region. So we'll have fun next week, and the following week, we have Patrick Bott and Dan Winter with our major announcement, Piezo Fire, breakthroughs in biofeedback and implosion harmonic devices, new releases in flamingmind.com, now in iOS and Mac, and plasmafire.com.
Yes, maybe I'll do and we wanted to say about the new edition of the last two events, new information on the Fractal U calendar, so that from Bali on May 12 and May 19, they're the only events which are not 2 p.m. New York time. They are 5 p.m. New York time. The last two events, May 12 and May 19, because our speakers are from Bali, and that's the wee hours. So on May 12, new Juan Schlosser and Josh Geiger are going to present the amazing $1 million new biologic architecture temple in India they're building. And remember, Juan Schlosser is the hero who pioneered measuring life force in buildings and proving the effect on seed germination. He's a specialist in bamboo architecture, amazing pictures, incredible. And by the way, related to that, also new on the calendar, April 28th, is Arturo and Lydia presenting all their new bioarchitecture material. But finally, on May 19, the last event on our calendar currently, we just added Alexa, Josh's partner from Bali, who's working with Iris here in Netherlands, teaching kids to see with eyes closed, bliss in kids, and biofeedback and brainwave in kids. We call it the Outer Vision Project. And they're both amazing in their work with young people. It's really going to be special. So that's the new Climax event series at FractalU.com.
And the long-awaited physical and not online physical conference that we are planning to do in the next autumn equinox. We are planning to do a conference with Dan. And Dan, would you like to explain some?
So, we had international conferences which were a bang up success in 2001, 7, 8, and 9. And then we kind of gave up during the COVID thing. And so, of course, we want to, because it's so wonderful to get together and we had so much fun and we've got so much new stuff and new friends. It's fabulous. And plus, Tufan has 500,000 friends on, is it Instagram? Yeah, anyway, so we're cooking up a new fun conference. We're thinking about September 20 internationally here in South France, to be announced, coming soon, lots of fun. So in case you want to play in South France in September, which is a fabulous time, we're cooking. We'll, to be continued.
We'll be doing Agnihotra together.
And I see that Dr. Ralph Otterpole has just joined us. He's our featured speaker, as Tufan said, is it next week. And Ralph has just completed a new book he's going to be telling us about. Ralph is a real hero in actually visualizing a life force in agriculture, regenerative agriculture, saving life force in water, and many things. Professor there in Germany. Ralph is really, when he spent some time here, he was my favorite friend. Ralph, really, you're my favorite friend. I want you to know
that. Likewise, Dan. Yeah, that's great. And looking forward to
serious fun to come. Serious fun to come. So I think maybe we're done with announcements, kind of. So now we're going to say it, say you said it, say you're going to say it, and then say you said it. So tonight's conversation, Teresa has really prepared. Remember, Teresa is a university professor of English and history. So she's a pro. Careful, guys. She is a serious pro and knows her history. So I cannot upstage any of that in any way. Now, on the physics side, I was going to do a short introduction. But first, I want to say why I love doing these things with Teresa specifically. Here's my reason, you guys. It's because I can ask her dumb questions about what happened to Dee and Kelly. Like, for example, when Vincent Bridges, who's everybody knows the story, a hero who remembered being Kelly and Flamel and Crowley, question mark. Anywho, so he says that when Kelly was in the tower, I think in Most, kind of dying because King Rudolph decided, if you ain't making gold for me. And so Vincent, did he lie to me when he said he didn't give King Rudolph the secret to alchemy because he thought King Rudolph did not have pure intention, only to find out later that actually it was the real reason that Kelly didn't make any more gold. He was making gold, real alchemy. Yes, real. And then Teresa's going to tell the documented stories. The real reason he didn't make any more gold for King Rudolph, question mark, was he was out of the magic red powder. Now, what is that magic red powder and what's the physics? So I'm going to take about 3 minutes, 5 minutes on that question just for colorful fun. And then we're going to introduce Teresa. Okay, that's the plan here, guys. So in terms of the physics, okay, now this is the physics. This is our excuse to talk about physics for 5 minutes only, promise. So what was the red powder? Well, theoretically, Vincent said, and I'd love to be corrected, but that the several hundred years during documented Muslim history, who was called the Mad Caliph, who went mad, presumably because he was eating the Philosopher's Stone, as they did tend to do in those days, which was, the history purportedly, according to Vincent, documents that about 1/3 the mass, the weight of the Kaaba stone, remember, this is a glass meteorite infused with the vapor, molten gold vapor. Remember, when a glass meteorite comes through the atmosphere, the only thing that survives the heat is the platinum group metals, gold, palladium, platinum. And they become vaporized into the glass and form a sponge geometry of nanobubbles in the glass, whose silicon content David Hudson supposedly proved cannot be discriminated from gold. The point being that when you have implosive nanobubbles of vaporized gold, not unlike implosive nanobubbles of hydrogen, they are phase conjugate negentropy implosive. And what that means is that nanobubble foam inside the glass meteorite makes what's called a phase conjugate dielectric, meaning a supercapacitor, meaning perfected charge distribution efficiency. Now, what is the physics of alchemy? The physics of alchemy is, alchem. L means the phase shift transition from transverse to longitudinal to make the L. For example, what you must do if you would like to lucid dream or survive death. You must be an L, which is one who can produce coherent longitudinal. We believe the meaning of L. So the transition from transverse to longitudinal. Hem, the original name for Egypt, the place of the blackness, or black soil, blue-black soil, or the blue-black blood of the Enki line, the Black Pharaohs. So alchemy as a term literally means a phase shift into access to the black hole, which means obviously non-destructive charge compression, charge implosion, in my language, charge collapse, the principle being, I believe, PlanckFire.com. So what needs to happen, remember, this hot mercury, one of the source materials you can start with, about 1 electron different than the atom of gold. What makes that difference is the ability, just like an ice skater pulling in her hands, increasing the rate of spin without getting dizzy or falling over. And the ability to not get dizzy when the ice skater pulls in her hands is the same as the Sufi proving to his master that he has pure intention because he can spin without dizziness, which is the physics of gravity, and that's another conversation. So the ability of that electron shell to non-destructively implode, collapse, is the trick, obviously. Now, there's a famous guy, his Joe Champion is his name. He wrote, well, not equations, he wrote a formula to predict the exact temperature for those isotope transitions. And that's how physicists talk about this. To transition the isotope is the charge collapse, the ability to move the charge between shells non-destructively. So when the charge collapses between electron shells and becomes more centripetal, there is literally the possibility of a transmutation event. And to catalyze that charge collapse, we now have a set of equations for both the critical temperature and the critical frequency for every commercially valuable isotope transition in the atomic table. And a lot of our people are deep into this physics of what you call alchemy. But what was the red powder then? Now, Vincent said, you take a little bit of that red powder, about the size of a grain of rice, and you pop it into this very hot mercury. And by the way, this was done in a particular kind of cup. I think there was a phonon element as well. But so he's got this size of the grain of rice of this, what we call a philosopher's stone. It's actually super dielectric. And under the right conditions, and there was a wetting agent, and this is the sort of secret sauce. What was the wetting agent that enabled the phase conjugate dielectric, the red powder, to dissolve into the mercury, to propagate and distribute, and thus distribute a charge distribution enabled capacitance called the philosopher's stone? Remember, the super dielectric that Nostradamus put on his mirror to call ancestors, which is the same way the Olmec used the obsidian mirror. It was the same phase conjugate coating. The purpose of the super dielectric, just like the shungite in the new piezo fire, super capacitive charge distribution, a lens for implosive capacitance. Same function as the shungite, actually, super dielectric. Anyway, so that super dielectric, the philosopher's stone, the magic sauce, enabled the capacitance, the charge field, to become perfectly distributed. And perfected distribution, obviously, is the physics of all collapse, all implosion. It's the name of heaven, etc. So you can do a whole thesis about, for example, if a capacitor has high enough a dielectric, it is by definition a zero-point energy device. And we're not going to go there right now. I'm just saying that if you understand a little bit about the physics of how the philosopher's stone is a supercapacitor, which is this permissive environment in which charge can be distributed. And lastly, how does this relate to the psychology of alchemy, where you get an environment, potential for bliss, and inside that implosion allows the spin to compress, where it becomes so dense that in the center, Kundalini, for example, you radiate this coherent longitudinal of the L, the phase shift, which is how you lucid dream and die well. It's also you make a Stargate. So the alchemy of the psychology of alchemy is also related to permissive capacitance named heaven or planes of Sharon, all these terms we have, or Champs-Élysées. So that perfect fractal electric field of perfected distribution enables this kind of collapse. Okay, so we're not going to talk much more about the physics tonight. This is just a little background, but I think it's super fun to think about the historical context, because Vincent Bridges, believe it or not, he actually understood most of what I just said, I think, actually, even though he was such a colorful person. So Terry knows the historical context in which these lessons were learned. For example, they could pick up the equivalent to the Philosopher's Stone on the streets of Prague because the Moldavite is a super dielectric. Because the reason Prague's magnetic map is a rose is because it's originally a meteoritic caldera, and that meteorite ... in the parallel. So I have carried on too much, and I think Terry has fun stories. So please, Terry.
Okay, well, I guess I have fun stories, but I don't know much about the physics. So as I asked you last week, you're going to have to carry the physics part of this, or Dan Mack can, because what I have to tell you about historical texts may, in fact, be quite boring by comparison, which isn't to scare people off here. I do want to say something about the red powder, though. If you just ask sort of a historian of alchemy about it, they'd say cinnabar has to be part of it. You see that in Zosimus of Panopolis, and I'm going to talk about his texts. They're the oldest in the tradition. The other thing in terms of what you'd have with the mercury and water, I know in the works of Zosimus, first of all, you have this great thing that goes on in Greek where your way of saying sulfur is the same way as saying divine. It's theon, so it can also mean like divine fire. So there tends to be some sulfur, some corrosive agent in the water. Now, the corrosive agent can be mercury itself, or it can be sulfur water. But before we started here, I was talking to Dan Mack about the procedures they had back then for, say, taking a copper lead alloy and making it look silver. Well, that would involve sulfur water. And actually, it winds up being called, and he can correct me if I'm wrong here, by the International Alchemy Guild. When you get to petroleum, that's supposed to mean sulfuric acid. But the idea from the old text is it comes from this sulfur water, divine fire in water. But
and just to
anyway.
say that the metaphor for much of this is sometimes called the flame that does not consume. If the sulfur fire actually gets spontaneously colder, then it's implosive and alchemic. And just one other thing, the cinnabar was the stone related to the derivation of mercury, and it's often involved in the Philosopher's Stone story as well. Please, Terry.
So, well, what I did was I put together kind of a slideshow, not quite as fancy as the one that Tufan did, just about the historical things. And then I thought I just, since a lot of it is on my YouTube channel where I'm talking about the Monas Hieroglyphica because of this alchemical text that John Dee finds, and so on. So then we could riff off of that into stories if you want, but I'm wondering, could I share my screen here? And if this gets too pedantic, yell and I'll quit.
Oh, no, please, please. We'd love to see your pictures, Terry. Yes, of course.
Okay, well, pictures, words, I work more with words, but I'm going to go from the Greco-Egyptian era up to the Renaissance. And as you've already said, alchemy, we get it from alchemy, it comes from ancient Greek through Latin. And let's see, I've got to rearrange things on my screen here because this is all, but anyway, what we want to look at is, since, by the way, al is also just, it's the Arabic article, right? But since al becomes el in Hebrew, which is Aleph Lamed, there are things that Dee does with the letter L that are very interesting that I think are a lot more similar to the kind of things Dan was talking about. But the question I have in tracing alchemy from the Greco-Egyptian period to the present is simply that in the Greco-Egyptian period, and by the way, that's the beginning of the Common Era. That's before the fall of the Library of Alexandria. So then the center of the Greek language and culture is not in what is Greece today, or for that matter, what is Turkey today. It's in northern Egypt, Alexandria, and go down the Nile south to Panopolis, the city of Pan, because the Greek god Pan gets merged with the Egyptian pantheon. It's what I call the age of assimilation. So that's where we get our first texts about alchemy. But these texts are not going to talk about the physics of it in the way that either Dan here is. So, but one of the things we know about Egypt before the Common Era is the abundance of gold. So any of you who saw like the most common way to know about that in the US is through the King Tut exhibits. You know that the center column was just solid gold. There were all kinds of gold items in there, coins. There are also gold sandals associated with Thoth Hermes the messenger, and that becomes important because our word for angels comes from the ancient Greek angelos, and that just, it means messenger. So it's not until about the 6th century of the Common Era that you get like the current Jewish, Christian, or Muslim meaning of angel. It's a messenger. It's Hermes, it's Thoth, some other messenger. It's easier to
We
talk
should say,
to.
Terry,
Yeah.
just to say that Thoth symbol, the caduceus, is literally charge collapse, and also mention that Vincent was convinced that much of the gold that we found in Egypt was alchemically produced, question mark. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead,
No,
Terry.
I'm only going to talk about, as I say, what I can talk about here. I know what Vincent thought about it. I have no reason to disbelieve him. But anyway, by the time that you see through the in the European tradition things that are associated with alchemy, you get like the Ouroboros serpent, the first manuscript we get of that is from the Codex Marcianus, which I'll talk about, and other drawings in the Common Era. And then once you recognize it, you see it going way back. But it has been great fun among alchemy scholars to try to interpret these pictures. Now, one of the questions that I'm going to get to pretty quickly is, what are we talking about with alchemy? Are we talking about lead into gold? Are we talking about metallurgy? We're talking about a lot of different things. The other thing you get over here is from the Codex Marcianus Graecus, a text I'll talk about. And so when you have alchemy, this from the Black Earth, as Dana said, the old name of Egypt, you also have a word that's a cognate with words like juice, sap, animal fluids, and those kind of things become also hints at what different meanings we might have for alchemy. So if someone thinks now alchemy led into gold, it's like, well, that in texts is not even the more significant thing. Now, I'll talk about that in a moment, but you have to remember Greco-Egyptians prize gold, but it means something different to them. Or, the idea is that it's the flesh of the gods is gold because why? Ra, gold colored, associated with the sun. In the merge system that you get by the Renaissance, you can also merge that with something like Kabbalistic ideas on the tree of life and Tiferet. So when Dan Winter talks about passing through the heart of the sun, for example, I always hear then, being in a Tiferetic state. That's gold. So in places like the famous House of Gold in Dendera, which is down the Nile even further south from Panopolis, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, the idea there is that you're becoming gold, you're merging with the divine. And the temples themselves are colored gold, and there are many metallurgical recipes that people can read now, and they describe metallurgy. Now, if you want to jump ahead to lead into gold, there's also a very good reason why, if Egyptians could produce gold, for example, that they're not in recipes, right? It's kind of dangerous if people think you know how to turn lead into gold, and if you're powerful enough that you don't care about that, maybe it's a King Midas thing and you want the gold to yourself. Some very traditional scholars have suggested that the reason that you get alchemical text in the beginning of the Common Era, or a little bit before that with the Ptolemies, is the Ptolemies were not Egyptian pharaohs. Ethnically, they were Greek. So some of the laws these scholars say got loosened, and so you could write about things that you couldn't write about before. Hence the work of people like Zosimus of Panopolis, who is before the fall of the Library of Alexandria, or the anonymous author of Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus, or people referring to the first actual identifiable human alchemists that we know. Mary, sometimes called Mary the Jewess, sometimes called Mary the Hebrew, sometimes Mary the Prophetess. Vincent had a theory that this was Mary Magdalene. Whomever it was, she was a real person, and her Bain Mary is a kind of distilling apparatus that can still be used. So the point that I wanted to make here, yeah,
they still call it Bain Marie in France all over. It's a particular
yeah,
water. It's called Bain Marie today.
right. And so the question that I always, when someone asks me like, well, what about making lead into gold? The first thing that I ask back is, well, how do you know that's the kind of alchemy that someone is talking about? Now we think today of spiritual alchemy. Of course, transformation and alchemy just have become kind of synonymous. But very quickly you have the physical alchemy of three kingdoms. So people in the International Alchemy Guild today, as I understand it, and Dan Mack, please correct me if I'm wrong, they can make a plant stone. So there's alchemy of the plant kingdom. There's alchemy of the animal kingdom, which is either, depending on your take on it, creating life itself, like golem making, or extending life. And there are really strange and interesting experiments that have to do with that, because then what you want is to collect the life force. Well, think of how you would collect life force. Actually, the person who discovered phosphorus was doing that because he was collecting his own urine for years, and it has a lot of phosphorus and it glowed. So there were, even 10 years ago, and I'm sure still today, there was a writer online purporting to have made the stone for the animal kingdom through years and years of collecting urea. Well, that's an interesting kind of gold, but I don't also think that's what the Egyptian texts are talking about, by the way. But it's a fascinating idea. So that's the animal kingdom. It's only in the mineral kingdom would you be talking about lead into gold or lead into silver. By the time that we get Christian Kabbalah coming in to the Italian Renaissance in the late 1400s, you also get these things conflated with a Christianized version of the Tree of Life. So Yesod, silver, Tifereth, gold. If you look at texts, though, before the Common Era, long before, like say in Greek works by Hesiod, or the Metamorphosis by Ovid in Latin, what you get is the idea of the alchemy of time, right? The golden age, followed then the silver age. There's also an age of heroes. With one of them, there's 5 ages and the other 4. Or think of the Christian idea of a coming golden age. I mean, it sounds, if you're used to looking at these texts, like another iteration of something that you've heard before. And in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, in this great Greco-Roman, Egypto-Hebraic, Christian, pagan fusion, all of these things overlie. And that's where you get the first alchemical texts that are readily available in the Renaissance. Although before then, you're going to get people who are alchemists. You get Roger Bacon, you get Flamel, and some other people. I want to just go over some
Terry,
super
Terry,
yeah.
Just super quickly. So the Tree of Life, we have an animation. Basically, you can animate in 3D dodecacosa tetracube, and you rotate them, and you have the shadow of the Tree of Life, meaning perfected charge collapse. And perfected charge collapse is actually how Kepler, for example, envisioned planetary orbitals as a nest of platonics, again producing golden ratio charge collapse. So many of these systems we can now relate very specifically to the idea of perfected nesting, creating golden ratio, and therefore charge collapse. So these ancient systems were introducing something powerful, and the metaphor of charge collapse may link them.
Yeah, although, so right now I'm going back 2,000 years before then. Although, I mean, yeah, Kepler is, doing what you're talking about 2,500 years later, and the texts then are in the Common Era are, well, they're 2024 plus years ago. Anyway,
Yeah,
I just wanted to review. Yeah.
You might think that, oh, we've solved these problems today, but actually, if you ask any physicist, no one on this planet seems to know why an object falls to the ground. And in fact, not one of them even seems to know why anything is centripetal, like life force, consciousness, and gravity. which is charge collapse. So no, this problem has not been solved. This is my humble opinion. Go ahead, Terry. Sorry.
Right, but you are still talking about turning lead into gold. My point is that not all alchemy is turning lead into gold,
Yeah.
but
Or in
certainly
mercury.
those problems haven't been solved. I mean, you know, the whole problem of gravity, it's fascinating that like there should be a giant discussion of this, and there is not. I know
you could start with what makes anything centripetal. That's the core question. And that's what alchemy is in essence. Yeah.
So, well, I just wanted to review some basic ideas of things that went on in Egypt for millennia that then informed things in the beginning of the Common Era, because people then perhaps cannot read hieroglyphs anymore, or maybe the high priest can. There's a whole debate about that I could get into. But the basic idea of becoming gold is simple. Egypt has become monotheistic. The sun god Ra, I mean, this is after the time Akhenaten. Ra, the sun, gold. He's born every day, goes across the sky 12 hours, dies in the west, goes through the underground. And so you even see that in where funerary complexes are. They're on the west. Why? Well, then you can think of Egypt as it looks like a huge country, but it's also this very narrow, almost north-south strip of the Nile that, you know, it has a few curves in it. But so this basic idea is governing all the many complications and assimilations that go on in the Egyptian afterlife. And you see, oh, just a second. It says my battery is running low here. That's not good.
Let me just say that, and we firmly believe that now precisely the valence geometry of the gold atom, the SPDF subshells, are specifically and precisely tetracube dodecacosa nested precisely. And the valence geometry of what makes gold noble is also the atomic geometry, the nuclear hadrons of gold, is also perfected charge collapse because the platonic nest is complete. So you see the idea of the perfect gold being the perfect heaven, the perfect sun god, perfect collapse, perfect implosion. It's all in, well, of course, to me, I have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So it's all charge collapse.
Well, you know, Dan, I think I should just let you talk because I have
No, because I don't know the
I have a
history.
here, so I had better.
No, but so that's the idea of looking at the history here, is that we've seen the history spread out in all directions, and that's a beautiful thing. But when we can distill it to a pure principle, then we can see through what makes it and us immortal, because it's the pure principle that's going to survive, not the personalities, obviously. So, you know, that's been kind of my life, looking for the pure principle behind these things, but much assisted by people like Terry, who've taken the time to do the history.
Well, thanks. Well, I tell you what, if you lose me here, it suddenly my computer battery is dying here, and I apologize for that, but it's dying.
Do you have a power thing there, Terry? Ah, oh dear, we've well, while we're waiting for Terry, I just wanted to say another piece of this puzzle that we're hoping that Terry is going to come back and talk about is where this impinged on the continuity of memory between lifetimes. So that our friend Vincent Bridges, as many of you know, we believed him when he said he had the continuous memory of lifetimes from Flamel to Kelly, actually to Crowley. And both Terry and I learned much about the physics of, for example, the Ophanim Enochian angel calls personally from Vincent. And it was Vincent's partner, Darlene, who actually drew the original graphics where we saw that the letters of Ophanim Enochian, the angel calls, which were used supposedly to make the movie Stargate. Because remember, if you take the spiral on the torus, self-organizing, and you index the symmetry using the tetracube, the 7 arrows, those shadows are Hebrew and Sanskrit. But Vincent illustrated to us the superset of that, and you can see this at goldenmean.info/Ophanim. which was what Kelly and Dee were working on at the time, how to call the angels. Remember, angels are a name for interstellar plasma intelligences. Michael Sarium calls them macrobes, and he didn't trust John Dee. Well, you can't blame him. It's complicated. But anyway, the point was that interstellar plasma intelligences have an alphabet, which is how their bodies are assembled by plasma donut symmetries. And the plasma donut symmetries specifically, and again, we don't have the pictures in front of us right now, but goldenmean.info/ophanum, the superset of tetracubic Hebrew Sanskrit is the hypercube symmetry, which is you take the same set of spirals and now you nest those vortex angles into a hypercube, which I believe is related to dodecaecosa, even though Vincent drew the hypercube more as cube octa. Point being that if you tilt the angle at which you're throwing donuts down the vortex accurately and make them implode into large plasma donuts, plasma domains, that's what we call angels. So, and remember in my first lecture in this series, we emphasized so enthusiastically that once you knew what it was that when plasma turned inside out recursively, implosively, what made it self-aware? Why is ball lightning so responsive to telepathy? Because the implosion at its center of toroids of plasma turning inside out recursively, that implosion connects the center of those vortices to the longitudinal array. Remember, when the vortex is perfect, then the transverse wave is converted at center, the Planck threshold. The squirt gun makes longitudinal EMF coherence, the only physics of gravity waves, if you believe Bearden, and the only physics of ancestor memory, if you believe me, and the only physics of what you need to propagate if you would like to lucid dream and take memory through death. You have to become longitudinally coherent. That is, when your aura, your glands, your DNA is imploded and squeezed, then the transverse EMF, which is less ordered, goes through the center of that squirt gun and propagates as coherent longitudinal EMF, literally the L as in Elohim, okay? The L is the one who can make that phase shift, and that literally is immortalizing. So when you use the hypercube symmetry of Ophanum and Nokian, you can implode very big plasma domains called angles, angels, interstellar plasma intelligence. Again, Michael Sarium called them macrobes. And he thought John Dee, he did call the big ones, but Michael Sarium thought that was also big trouble. And it's true. You know, if you have astral hygiene problems talking to your local ghosts, imagine what kind of astral hygiene problems you might have if you're starting to talk to interstellar plasma ghosts. You might need really good astral hygiene skills.
Then we have a couple of questions. Shall we go over them before Terry joins us?
I think that's a fun idea. Sure. Go ahead. Let's just carrying on. Yes, please do.
So first one from Liz. Does ingesting ormus or monoatomic gold improve the possibility by conduction?
Well, thank you. Yes. So we put the note in there. I have several dozen articles on the biophysics of monatomic gold at goldenmean.info/gold powder. And you're right, it is related to the issue of conductivity at a more subtle level. It's related to the fact that monoatomic gold is also a perfect phase conjugate dielectric. It's the perfect capacitor, which is why we think ormus, a gold powder, remember there were hundreds of pounds of this stuff in Moses's old laboratory as he had changed his name from Akhenaten, we think. So either Moses, who was the founder of the Essenes, remember the Jesus bloodline is directly, quote, out of Egypt, which, by the way, is the name of the book. And so, yes, the Essenes made money because they were gold powder cooks. And what was that gold powder doing? Remember, the Ark of the Covenant had a spark gap. They called it the mercy seat. And the implosion of that spark gap had the capability to stabilize nanoparticles of gold in the monoatom state, because normally gold in a monoatom state is not stable. However, if you use that spark gap, very much related to the carbon arc, that was the beginning of all of Tesla's magic, the spark gap on the Ark of the Covenant. Originally, remember, the Ark of the Covenant was an implosive capacitor used by the Syrians to non-destructively contain the nukes, which the Anunnaki required because there were such klutzes to be able to get through the Van Allen belt. They required nukes. So the Ark of the Covenant made the plague of Azoth, which was radioactive poisoning, basically. And also, because it was implosive capacitor, it had gold on the outside, super dielectric acacia wood, golden ratio, implosive capacitor, centripetal, which is the definition of how you contain radioactivity. If you're not as stupid as our nuclear engineers, you know how to contain radioactivity non-destructively with implosive capacitance. Orgone being a crude name for an example. But anywho, so that spark was used to stabilize gold, and so they made the gold powder. Now, to propagate that, it has been interpreted, the Ark of the Covenant was called the transportable one with the tanks. There was a special, I don't know if it was a blue-black, but there's a special, it's called a shaggy algae, which was specifically an algae trained to eat the nano gold, and the byproduct made that gold soluble, which is how it became soluble in blood. And you had to bake the sulfur out after the algae, and that's why they called it show bread, because they literally had to bake the bread, literally the manna from heaven, which later became called Holy Communion. And it was served not just in the round white wafer Holy Communion, but it was also served in a pine cone shape, which is what the gold statue at Rennes the Chateau distributes, because that is a full service City of the Dead. You had to have gold powder if you were a full service City of the Dead.
Dan, sorry, Terry just joined us.
Oh, good. Terry's back. So to finish the thought, though, so the gold powder, then your eyes turn blue and you live forever, but oops, read the fine print, you might lose your soul. The issue was that if actually Thoth taught about this, he said that the consumption of the gold powder could literally fractionate the soul and attention span due to a kind of addiction unless the right psychological exercises were used. And in fact, those who you consume some of the very dangerous David Hudson ormus, we saw a fractionation of attention, which is related to some of the issues around microhydrogen, actually. Because if your attention is imploding and you eat all that spin and you can't inhabit that tornado and steer it, there is a fractionation of attention, literally reduced attention span. So there's a whole bunch of issues around the consumption of monatomic gold. The short summary, though, would be the more organic sources, the rhodium, iridium, the aloe, manatech, manalo, the natural derived sources, even the deep seawater derived, when the deep seawater has that potential because it has rhodium, iridium, emulet, and you can precipitate out that milky substance with the alkaline. So big story about gold powder, but there's a little taste of it. But since Terry is back, shall we, Terry?
Well, sure. I won't go into that PowerPoint again. I'm real sorry. I'm glad that we're a two-computer family. So now you can see our lovely Christmas lights that we haven't taken down. Anyway, what I wanted to talk was going into that whole other spiel about was just to talk about why gold was so sacred in Egyptian thought, and the idea when the pharaoh dies that there is this long going through the underworld. I had some pictures I was going to show you of the Book of the Dead and that kind of thing. And the idea is you become one with Ra. Now, this is also how you have God indwelling in statues. So the first text we have from people like Zosimus in that common era, and there's a big debate about if Zosimus is Christian or Jewish or the old religion, and I'd say, oh, it's the same thing. But the idea is with the opening of the mouth ceremony, which some of you may know, that you're breathing the breath of light into these statues. But the idea is that's the light of the gods. It's becoming divine. And some of you may know on my in my Monas Hieroglyphica class, we've talked about the whole idea of becoming gold being Tiferet. So those are what some of the texts were that I was going to talk about. There's also a really famous text, and I know Dan knows this text, the Codex Marcianus Graecus 299. That's where we get Isis the prophetess to her son Horus, where here is this story of alchemy you get. I'll tell you in a moment, but how is this related to earlier alchemists like Roger Bacon, Nicholas Flamel, even George Ripley, those who said they had the powder in effect? So that's where I'm going with all of this. So in the most simple and earliest story in the Codex Marcianus, there is this Hebrew sounding archangel, meaning the name sounds like it's from Hebrew, Amniel. And Isis the prophetess, okay, so this is a goddess, right? Talking to a Hebrew archangel. That's kind of odd to begin with. And Isis appears to be, for a variety of reasons, in the underworld. Well, one reason might be that Set has just killed her husband Osiris, right? And she's writing this to her son Horus, but she remembers him literally, and Osiris becomes Horus. All right, so there's that whole backdrop. Isis says to Amniel, who is kind of showing up and flirting with her, and it's a whole Book of Enoch kind of thing, right? He's this, and he thinks Isis is kind of attractive. It's kind of the ultimate way to offend everyone in every religion that's fused together there, right? So this archangel appears, thinks Isis is very attractive. She's not interested in him because she's working on her alchemy. And so then she says, well, if you give me the key to alchemy, I will, whatever. You can interpret it as have sex with you. I think a more appropriate way of interpreting it would be like merge energy bodies with you, but however you want to interpret it. And so Amniel agrees to do this. So they sort of energetically merge, and oh, she's got the secret of alchemy. And then she's telling it to her son Horus. Well, I would say the subtext of this, although many scholars don't agree with me, fine, but is, well, she's realized the secret of life. This is how she brings her son Horus to life, which is what she does in myth, right? So that alchemical secret from which we get the famous quotes like nature rejoices in nature, and only a lion can make a lion. I guess only a goddess can make a god like Horus, but it's the secret of life. It's not the secret of gold. So this finishes, and then there are a bunch of metallurgical recipes follow that you can use to gold plate things. I also had wanted to show you how the House of Gold in Dendera is, which is south of Panopolis, the in Greco-Egyptian Egypt, the city absolutely the most associated with alchemy. The idea of becoming gold, coloring things gold, coloring statues gold, is to become one with the gods. Okay, so fast forward and we'll get to these Kelly stories. I think Dan knows better perhaps than I do, but so you get works like that written down, and John Dee discovers them a couple years before he writes the Monas Hieroglyphica. And I've argued elsewhere that it's the combination of knowing Christian Kabbalah and having this alchemical text, I think, that leads to the Monas Hieroglyphica. In fact, I'm sure it is. It's not a provable thing. But Dee finds this in Venice, copies it it's in ancient Greek. Dee's an expert in ancient Greek. He copies it by hand. But that book that is the oldest surviving manuscript doesn't come from Venice. It comes from Istanbul, which was then Constantinople. And it's not from actually Istanbul either. It was probably, I would say, brought there centuries before, because it's copies of copies of copies. It comes from Panopolis, which if you look at where Alexandria, Egypt is and go down the Nile, that's quite a ways south, but the Panopolis was even called Chemis by the Greeks because it was so associated with alchemy. But these things have to do with tincturing things gold, making copper lead alloys and making them look silver than gold. But you still see the stages there that you see in Renaissance alchemical works, like the 12 gates. Well, the 12 gates of the underworld that you have to go through to become gold and merge with Ra are as an easy idea for the 12 gates. The idea that you have to be spiritually pure. Well, Mott will weigh your heart in the underworld, and it has to be lighter than a feather. So many of you know those things. And so I would say scholars today argue, I think, pretty persuasively, if you're talking about the text rather than the physics, that these oldest alchemical texts that are then resurrected into the Renaissance don't necessarily have to do with lead into gold. They have to do with immortal life is what they have to do with. The other thing is you get people who are writing about alchemy before the Codex Marcianus Graecus, but it's stylistically, if you read them, they're way different. You get Roger Bacon giving instructions for making the Philosopher's Stone, and that's in the 1200s. It's right after the time of the Cathars, but if you analyze what he's talking about, it's a little creepy. He's talking about making gunpowder, actually, which, you know, I guess is one kind of Philosopher's Stone if you have your idea of charges is not charge collapse, but something very different. Anyway, after that, you have Flamel and George Ripley. Ripley is a person that Dee likes, and then Kelly takes up, whose his bosom book and his 12 Gates are associated with alchemy. And there's others like Norton. Flamel, you've already heard me talk about, Dan, that I mean, what Flamel does is fascinating. We have his woodcuts, but there's no evidence from his time that he even existed. So then I'd ask you, how did our friend claim he was Flamel? Actually, Vincent was the one that told me when he knew I was researching Flamel. He said, well, you're not going to like what you find. So Vincent also knew that there weren't texts in his own time. What I think is that it's very interesting to look at how that was sort of leaked into the Western mystery tradition. And then I'll fast forward.
Just to
Yeah.
say, but we were so much hoping the Flamel story would matriculate historically, because then all the Harry Potter fans and Emma Watson would have a way in to see that alchemy was in fact spiritual, right out of Harry Potter. But I just want to make one other quick comment, Terry, was that, you know, Osiris was supposedly able to go into the heart of the sun, which is the chief feature of who is Ra, who is Enki, who is Osiris.
Right.
It's literally every ancient religion was a sun god religion. And to pass through the heart of the sun is, according to any advanced shaman, the only way in or out of here, actually. And I would remind that when the most advanced clairvoyants, Leadbeater and Besant and others, examined the heart of the sun and the heart of the human and the heart of hydrogen, they saw the same thing. They called it Anu. It was 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. Obviously, 7 spins tetracube, 5 spins dodecacosa. Literally a platonic nest of perfected charge collapse. The golden heart of the sun, the golden heart of the human, the golden heart of hydrogen is all the same principle. And then if you can inhabit perfected charge collapse, which is to say, gain inertia during collapse, heart of gold, not growing old. So the pure principle here seems to be able to inhabit that lightning of that pure implosion. And any shaman that goes through the heart of the sun, and it's obviously an eyeball, cool and not hot at all, and does not come back dizzy, has passed the test. And otherwise, you're not a sun god, actually. So there's an alchemic lesson there. Anyway, please.
Well, no, and these ideas, what I was is they match perfectly the things you've talked about with going through the heart of the sun. I would say they match that, from my limited understanding, better than how you would change isotopes and change lead into gold. I mean, I think they're different kinds of alchemy. Could be wrong. I'm not a physicist and don't pretend to be. But you know, the other thing, since we had talked about Vincent also talked about how you do that with using shapes. And one of the things that you have to deal with in ancient and all the way through the Renaissance alchemical text is the 5 elements, the 4, and then the hidden 5th that is spirit, ether, associated with the dodecahedron. So the way that scholars, and very good scholars, have explained this is quite unsatisfactory. I won't name names and go into it, but it's the idea that you make the circle round, which is something George Ripley has a wheel, and so you turn it and 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, you're back where you started, and you've done this with a square, you're making the circle round, and the idea is because of like the hot or moist characteristics associated with this particular element, you lose one, you gain another, you go 90 degrees. It's like you can't, I mean, my understanding of science is strong enough that it's like, that ain't going to work. Okay. So if that's what Ripley is doing, that's a cover for something else. So what Vincent was saying when we were talking about this, make the circle round. Now, who knows? Vincent would blow smoke when he wanted to, as you know, but he did this with ceremonial magic and actually the pentagram. And the idea was what you see as a flat pentagram is 5 90-degree turns, not 4. So that matches your 5. That's the pentagram. Then you work with the hexagram. You remember his bit about, well, real magic means you've got to follow a pent with the hex. And a lot of ceremonial magicians would say, well, pentagram is the microcosm, hexagram's the macrocosm. So then you get to the hex and you have 7 turns with the hex. So that was his formula in terms of ceremonial magic for getting you to Tifereth on the beginning of the Briatic. So you can take the great tree of life and divide it into 4 worlds. The lowest world is only associated with the bottom Sephira, which is Malkuth. This is condensing a lot into a short space, I'm sorry, but Malkuth is the physical world. After that, you have the Yetziratic and then the Briatic. Well, this was his formula to get you right at this place that is the overlap of Tifereth in the Yetziratic and Malkuth of the Briatic. So that seems to correspond to what you're saying about 5-7. At least he thought it did, and I always thought I'd have many more years to talk to him about it. So there's that anyway. Do you want me to jump into your friend Edward Kelly?
Yes, but just to say, remember that fundamentally, geometrically, the tetracube with the hex shadow, there's that particular 32-degree tilt in the Star Mother that then you spin that tetra and you blink 5 times and you have pentodeca, and that's for the first time you've made golden ratio. So literally 5 spins and 7 spins. So that relates to the very ancient argument we had with Vincent for his whole life about whether the ultimate form of the hypercube was the dodeca. And that isn't really the important question. The important question is how you superpose the next axis of spin symmetry to go to quote the next dimension, which is obviously phase conjugate and emit longitudinal. So that introduces the beautiful electrical engineering if you look at it in that way, the only door to the next dimension. But anyway, yes, please. So to the Kelly story, is that where we're going here
So,
now?
well, the first time that you get multiple people witnessing someone change something into silver, or in other cases into gold, was with Kelly. So the question becomes, how did Kelly did that? And we know that Vincent's answer to that was, well, he had powder, he ran out of powder, he thought he was going to be able to make the powder again and couldn't. That actually doesn't sound like an implausible story to me. So then the question would be, where did Kelly get the powder? Now, Vincent also thought that at that time, that Kelly, to make anyone to believe him, would have had to have come up with a huge amount of gold. Well, I don't think for somebody, it would appear that just from the things in Dee and Kelly's conversations with angels, the so-called Enochian work, right? There's ample evidence that Kelly is incredibly clairvoyant. So if you're clairvoyant, what is something else you can do well? Dowsing. I live here in the lead country of Southwest Wisconsin, where there are plenty of dowsers. People dowse for water, you dowse for metals. In Bohemia, one of the things that had happened right before Dee and Kelly got there was really the first Protestant Reformation. I mean, the one with Luther is far more famous, but there was the Hussite rebellion, and it was brutally put down. And as part of that, churches were sacked. If you know the story in England of Henry VIII when he broke with the church, well, you have something kind of similar but not as famous that went on in Bohemia then. So a lot of the church's gold is out in the countryside. So Kelly could easily have come up with gold by dowsing for it. I mean, somebody who is that clairvoyant, would people have done that before him? Of course they would have. But there was, my take on Kelly is that it would be hard to find someone more clairvoyant than he was. For one thing, there was a reason that he and Dee needed one another. And Dee himself, it would appear from the things written down there, is pretty clairvoyant. So, okay, so having said all of that, there are ways that Kelly could have come up with using his clairvoyance and his ability to dowse with a lot of gold without making it alchemically. But if he had the powder, which is what Vincent said, then to me the question is not what did Kelly learn from, say, if he read Dee's or looked at Dee's Codex Marcianus Graecus, which I'm sure he did, even though it was in Greek and he claimed not to read Greek. I'm sure he understood the Monas Hieroglyphica. I'm sure but where did he get the powder from? I think that's the question. And I would submit that while most people say he got the powder from England and that's why he was able to be welcomed back to Dee and all of that, that probably that powder came either from Rhodes or from Egypt. And, you know, it's a longer thing in my study of the biography of the life of Kelly. But I think that I think that's where he got the powder, and he never did figure out how to make it himself.
But and just to say that when Vincent always began his story of Kelly and his past lives with the trauma in the Crusades, when the rabbi cursed him for being up to his waist in the blood of the Jews and the Muslims for being on the wrong side of the war, and said, "You will never forget a lifetime until the end of the Catholic Church," actually. But the point was that somehow connected him with Egypt and his continuous stories about the Kaaba stone from Egypt, which he says Peter the Hermit.
That was his Mad Caliph story. Yeah, as you talked about at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and he said Peter the Hermit came back and sold the first crusade based on the fact that he'd personally witnessed alchemy there in Egypt. And therefore, the rich people had to donate because otherwise the Muslim would take over the world because they were already doing alchemy. And that's how Peter the Hermit managed to sell the stock for the first crusade.
Well, and the idea in Vincent and Jay Widener's book, which is about the cross in Hendaye in France, but it winds up having this whole history of alchemy that talks about that Isis the prophetess to her son Horus manuscript that I mentioned and so on, was that he thought that what was going on in the Holy Land at that time before the First Crusade was, first of all, Christians, Muslims, and Jews getting along just fine. I mean, Jews were not called Jews, so you would be looking at kind of an Arabic Muslim doing, his rabbi would have been not called a rabbi. But other than that, I mean, the story makes sense that they were doing research on something, they figured out how to do something, and that the idea of the Christian members there was that they were supposed to go back to Europe and send more people down to study. And instead, you got this kind of bloodlust of, no, let's go steal the gold. Then there's the Templar treasure and the whole tragic story of the Cathars. I mean, you're pretty near there to Cathar country, but you know, was that gold? I mean, no one can prove one way or the other, but certainly the Templars and the Cathars had some kind of gold from somewhere.
They probably actually found the Ark, many people believe, and that was a key to gold making, and that's a whole other story here. But so the story of the Templars fits in here in terms of Vincent's own history and his tragic memories of South France. But another story.
And then there's other memories you can put in. It depends on, you know, how far out do you want to go? I mean, I'm sure, I guess it is still some kind of controversy if a place that is now called Atlantis existed, even though Plato refers to it in two different works. I don't have particularly any problem saying it existed. And when you have people talk about their past life memories there, they're talking about incredible things done with the crystals, which it seems to me now you're back to people who clearly have technology to do something like change isotopes, change one thing into another. And so, you know, I've heard other people make arguments, unprovable arguments, and you can't argue against them either, that would there have been some precipitating stone there that was found in Egypt? I mean, some people have argued that. I just look at old texts. But
we do have a class coming up on a new description of the history of Hermes in the FractalU series, which starts with Elena Denon answering the original reason Hermes Thos Ningishita, at that time called Ishka. The reason he accompanied Enki, later called Osiris, and Ea. Here on the messy Anunnaki mission was specifically to be the alchemy teacher. And the symbol of Hermes obviously being caduceus, which obviously the lead into gold is a minor part of that. Actually, a major part of the alchemy was creating a gene pool that could have a soul by imploding the DNA, the caduceus conjugation, the whole thing. So that story is part of an upcoming course based on extending the ET history story from our time with Elena Denon. But
even if you're, even if you're looking at the Renaissance, another understanding of alchemy in the Renaissance had to do with royal bloodlines. I mean, there's no question about it. Now,
exactly.
there is the little problem that everyone's sort of preferred bloodline is also the one that wipes out the greatest number of people. So be careful which bloodlines you're talking about. But there's no question that it's meant that when you even in the beginning of the early modern era, that's still the same thing. And the idea of alchemy as a solution for infertility. I mean, that was part of the reason that Rosenberg was so taken with Dee and Kelly in Trebona, which is he was the last of the house of Rose Mountain, Rosenberg. And he had no heir. In fact, Europe at that time seemed plagued by people who didn't have legitimate heirs. So then, there's that whole meaning of alchemy. But anyway, another place, another thing related to Kelly with that powder is that, it's interesting if you take Vincent at face value that he had the memories of Kelly, which you and I both do. I mean, I don't necessarily have this, rabbit after leapfrogging rabbit idea of the same consciousness lifetime after lifetime. I think one of the things we really need is a metaphysics of consciousness that talks about what are we really talking about if we're talking about reincarnation. And you and I have talked about that a lot, but I don't have any doubt, as weird as it sounds, that Vincent had these particular memories. I suspect it was an earlier incarnation of Vincent, frankly, that put this Flamel story out there. I mean, Nicholas Flamevel, or as he called him, Nicky Flamevel. I mean, it's not a real name. It's talking like the flame and the L, like you were talking about. So anyway, if you have the memories that he had. Why don't we know who Kelly's parents are? Isn't that kind of interesting? I ask him, like, why don't you remember that? One of the things that will cause you to forget something is hatred, even if you're trying to get rid of that. I mean, that will break up a particular kind of memory. So I think that Kelly got that powder from the father that Kelly didn't want to talk about, but that would take us really far afield.
That's a fabulous story. When Teresa tells that story, my jaw dropped. I love that story. The royal family of Ireland. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm going to write that up and put it out. But and they have found in Germany Kelly's letters from England, but the English were like plantation owners where they'd taken over things in Ireland, signed by them and the Irish people who would have been in the royal family saying, yes, he's part of this royal family. Okay, well then if you figure out from that who his father was, that doesn't work. But there is a significant Irish royal character who I won't name the name here, but if you know who I'm talking about, go ahead and write your paper on it before me because no one's going to believe my paper on it anyway. But
Irish royalty. That's important. That's Tuatha De Danann, the Lord of the Gods. I mean, oh my God, Irish royalty.
I mean, he was snuck out of Ireland so that the English couldn't kill him, was raised in a French court that was very permeated with alchemical ideas, then was shifted to an Italian court, then wound up getting a reputation for a great healer, then went to Rhodes, and then through a series of interesting events came back to England and agreed to become Protestant. And apparently if my story is right, agreed to utterly repudiate Kelly, who was already there, hooked up with Walsingham and that group. So that would give Kelly plenty of reasons to dislike this father. But I mean, you can't prove any of that, but that's my working thesis on Kelly and where he got his powder from, that it came from his father, who got it in Rhodes, learned what it was with people who were in Italy very, very interested in alchemy, the Medicis, which they're quite
Yeah.
so.
If you ever heard Vincent tell his red powder stories, man, your jaw dropped. It was vivid. It was a sharp recollection. It was intense. Like how the mad caliph went mad eating it, and all the philosophers ate their philosopher's stone because they thought they'd get immortal. And what does that mean? Oh, it was colorful.
Yeah, and his mad caliph store wasn't it wasn't the red powder, it was ground up parts of the Kabbast, which I guess would have turned red. But it's also a good way to get yourself in lots of trouble talking about, since this is the most sacred stone and you can't examine the Kabbast stone, I mean, or do a physical analysis of it. It's quite not allowed.
But I mean, he explained to me the chemistry of glass meteorites in some detail, origins of the cobblestone, quote, Lucifer's eye. What made it Lucifer's eye? Hello. I mean, oh, is this colorful?
So anyway, but that's about all I got for you here, Dan. I was going to talk a little bit more about that other stuff from Zosimus, but I can't. I could paraphrase it, but without the eye candy, and it's not quite as interesting. Anyway.
This is so people in the audience who are not familiar with the Vincent Bridges story, we apologize. There's vincentbridges.com, and you can read Terry's books or my books or whatever. It's all there. But still, I think we've touched enough on some of the principles behind alchemy, and we had some fun. We could have more fun, but maybe we should check the questions. Is that appropriate here?
Sure. Yeah. The first one is, could Ra on the solar bark be Newton's rings?
Could you say that again?
Newton.
Oh,
Newton's rings.
Newton's rings.
Well, I don't know if I can relate to the end of that question, but Ra as sun god, remember, every ancient religion was sun god religion, because ultimately, if your aura don't get big enough to grow up and inhabit a star, you ain't interesting. I mean, you didn't get out of a small kindergarten a long way from downtown. And Ra obviously indirectly is now referring to Osiris Enki, the one who, if he didn't inhabit the sun, the Nile would not flood, and they had to fire the pharaoh. So, I have my memories of Tutankhamun fit there, because if you couldn't make rain, they fired the pharaoh, and I had that memory. So, but Newton's ring?
Yes.
What's meant by Newton's ring here?
I don't know.
Yeah, Newton. I mean, Newton also, I think he was postulating in advance the concept of electron shells, which is charge collapse, which is a set of rings, or the rings of the planet orbitals, which are also charge collapse. So you could take that in many directions. Anyway,
sure.
Go ahead.
Another one from Ralph. He asks if biological transmutation, alchemy equals spiritual transmutation.
Yes. Well, biologic transmutation obviously is very relevant here. Louis Kevron's famous work that the sweating miners were able to actually make phosphorus in their body, and that chickens actually make calcium by transmuting atoms. So the literature on biologic transmutation is powerful and relevant here. So the kinds of fusion and isotope transitions, if you do the research, you see biology is absolutely capable of transmuting. There is no question. Louis Kevron is only the beginning on there. And does that relate to spiritual transmutation? Absolutely. That when the inner flame is that intense, literally the flame that does not consume, I would relate it to the story of Kundalini or bliss, or however one of you talk about that inner flame, that precisely the reason that flame does not consume is it's implosive, for the same reason that Schauberger's vortex spontaneously got colder just before that piezo water vortex began making voltage from gravity, literally non-destructive charge collapse, literally to gain inertia during collapse. So that is the right metaphor.
Could
Yes, A follow-up
Hello.
comment on that question is
But did Terry want to say something? Terry, did you?
Well, I was just going to ask you a quick
Oh.
question with this, Dan, because there's a common Renaissance excuse of why the alchemist doesn't succeed, and it is usually, well, my assistant isn't spiritual enough or something like that. I mean, there's the idea that for this to work, someone has to be of a high spiritual attainment. But
Nice.
then my follow-up to that is, Kelly, as much as we love him, let's say he had some issues. So I think with the powder, what can you overpower the lack of spiritual attainment, or would you say that Kelly had that?
Well, that's the issue. I think it led to corruption, clearly. So he didn't have the flame that wouldn't consume. That's the exact issue. He did not demonstrate pure intention, I think. But I think Ralph, were you trying to say something? Did we cut somebody off here? Who was trying to say something?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. I thought someone was trying
Hello,
to say.
hello.
Yes, go ahead.
I thought ether, one type of material. Is there anything related to ether? Transmutation?
Say
Ether.
that again. Say it again.
Ether.
Etal?
Ether. E-A-E-T-H-E-R. Okay. E-T-H-E-R.
Are you referring? Ether. Oh, the ether. Yes. What about ether?
Yes.
Well, we think our view would be there is absolutely a unified field, and it is absolutely only the infinitely compressible superfluid named charge, and the circulation there about is sometimes called the ether. So the superfluid named charge, literally compression and rarefaction of charge named plus and minus charge, is the only stuff of the unified field, sometimes called ether, which propagates as a superfluid. And the wave interference geometry, when that rotates, you store the rotation, store the inertia, which is the only definition of mass. And when that rotates, you create a period of rotation, the only definition of time, that is literally relative spin rate. So ether is a name for the superfluid compressible ether in that view. And then charge collapses. Go ahead.
To follow that up, if you were taking these modern ideas and projecting them back into the Renaissance, for example, at the time after you get this Christian appropriation of rabbinic Kabbalah, which then turns into Hermetic Kabbalah, I mean, you have in the Sefer Yetzirah, first of all, the ether is associated with Kether. The other elements, if you need all 5 elements to create anything in the physical world, which is the world of action, Malkuth, and then a whole little mini tree in Malkuth, you have to have ether, and you might have a parabolic mirror at the bottom, but then the idea is the other 3 elements, not, in other words, ether, and not earth, but water, fire, and air, are in the Sefer Yetzirah. They're in the intervening, in the middle area there, and when they're in pure form. The minute that you get into the world of action, everything is all mixed up. You get that in Plato's Timaeus, among other places. So, but once you get everything solidifying in Malkuth, so the spiritual alchemy goes anyway, to move back up, you have to have the reflection of the divine light, which was the ether.
Which is another way of saying origin of negentropy, the way back up the ladder, perhaps.
No, I think that's right.
But let's go on to the next question then. Thank you, Terry. Thank you for your question.
Sure. Next one from Leaf. I was meditating, watching my third eye plasma, and imagined nesting tori getting smaller and smaller, and I was physically shocked, like a light socket. How would you describe what happened?
Oh, good. Well, getting smaller there, that when there is implosive compression of nested torus, literally a vortex in a vortex, suddenly becoming centripetal and imploding, you would feel a lightning spark at the center. Metaphor example, when you feel that lightening up your tailbone of Kundalini. So indeed, I would say one way to interpret that would be the experience of spontaneous implosive compression, which is absolutely what we're talking about here, for sure. Very interesting and encouraging dream. Remember, whether you call it Kundalini or not, when you absorb that level of charge density in your spine, in your body, intense bliss, for example, it's a fabulous, wonderful launching pad to rapid evolution. And it's often dangerous, as Kundalini is, because when you experience that lightning bolt, if you don't know how to steer the tornado, if you don't know how to ground afterwards and remineralize and all those things, it can drive you nuts. It's dangerous. So absolutely taste that bliss, but absolutely learn the hygiene of getting grounded and nourished afterwards. And above all, your life depends on your inner guide telling you when to stop. If you inhabit lightning too long, there is such a thing as too much. Absolutely. So you want to get close to that lightning bolt, as Daniel Brinkley did, but learn the hygiene of that intense bliss has stresses on the nervous system, on the nutrients, etc. Your crown chakra burns. Believe me, I know that story. So yes, you're getting close to intense bliss, which is fabulous. And learn to interpret that, learn to create a journal, learn to turn what you have seen into some form of service so that it gets grounded, and then you won't go nuts. But a blessed dream, really. Anyway, for what it's worth. My 2 cents.
Right.
Next question, Bubs. Yeah.
Christopher asks, my teacher in Bagua circle walking, very similar to Sufi whirling, says about the dizziness setting in when people walk in circles is craziness leaving the body. So would it be appropriate to continue whirling even though dizzy and thus getting more aligned with your principle?
Oh, I love that metaphor of craziness leaving the body. I like that metaphor. Well, yeah, I mean, classically, there are even magazine articles about the physics of gravity based on Sufi dervish turns. I have some slides from my slideshow, but it's true. So that the essence of why you do not get dizzy if you have pure intention is like this. When you go to bed, if you can play your day backwards like a film and not interrupt, it means you've digested your day, which means you will not be distracted. Okay. So the same thing when the dervish is turning, which is to say, you must keep referring your attention back to center so continuously that absolutely any distraction and evil, just like what you need to be doing at the moment of death, if you want to succeed, distraction is absolute loss. So if you can keep that focus of your attention, the idea is Shelley's website, theshareablewave.com. The shareable wave exists at the center of that tornado. It is absolute stillness, it's absolutely electric, and it's absolutely connected to everything. And you cannot stay there if you're not shareable, which is to say, everything there is pure principle. Everything there is pure lightning. And that radiance into that array has a ticket to enter the door, which is, you have digested your day. Every wave, everything you've experienced all day is now distilled to pure principle. It's perfectly shareable. You can completely relax into that electric center and distribute your memory into a perfectly shareable everything is served by all of your memory, and anger absolutely will not compress. And that's why it's the correct test for the Sufi dervish turning. And yes, that means the craziness is flying out. I like it. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Next one is from Shelley. Let's ask Elena if she can speak about Apollo, Python, and Enki's mother, Samothea, also Ptolemy, David Adair, Shungite, and Positive AI.
Well, Elena has talked about Enki's mother at some depth. I don't think she's talked about Ptolemy from David Adair, but yeah. Anyway, but unfortunately, it's not my role to tell Elena Danan what to talk about. But indeed, many who are working with her are dealing with those issues. Thank you, Shelley.
Okay, next one is from Daniel Zulaga. Thank you, Terry and Dan. My question is, has anyone either of you know of personally or not, in modern times or recent past, attempted to engineer and reproduce an Ark of the Covenant black star hole in a gold acacia wood casket with said 5 proportions? What applicable range of functions would it perform in modern day? What is the black star hole elementally composed of? Mercury, I'm sure, somewhere. then I'm sure you have put thought into engineering this. I'm grateful for both your inputs.
Well, first, there are many who have attempted to build models of the Ark of the Covenant. There are even documentaries about it. The core physics is actually teachable and tunable. So remember, the outer shell is gold. It's in golden ratio proportion rectangle. And the inner material is a super dielectric, that acacia wood. The finer grained hardwoods are higher dielectric. And remember, the function of that is literally that the capacitance, the resonance electrically of the sides, by assuming that golden ratio cascade, become implosive capacitance, sometimes incorrectly called orgone. Original function, I believe, by the Syrians who designed it, was for the non-destructive containment of the nukes. And most scientists who are willing to think about it eventually understand that implosive capacitance is the electrical opposite of radioactivity. I would just say I was there in Keshe's living room when TEPCO phoned him to say, yes, the nanomaterials had reduced the radioactivity. So implosive capacitance, phase conjugate capacitance, is a container for nukes, absolutely. What the new information is, now we know how to spectrum analyze such structures and tune them and optimize that implosion, which is identical with how we teach by measurement how to create life in buildings. And the conversation upcoming with Juan Schlosser is precisely about that. When you learn to spectrum analyze a building to know which building will cause a seed or a child to grow by measurement, and thus which architect should get a paycheck, you are doing exactly what needs to be done to make the perfect Ark of the Covenant, actually. And yes, that will be a device which could stabilize gold monoatoms. It's the same physics. So implosive capacitance is another name for pure fusion. It's another name for pure alchemy, actually. So anyway, there's a lot that could be said. Did you want to say something, Terry? Or
I have nothing to add. That's great.
okay, okay. Was there a next question there? How are we doing?
Yes, two more. Dan Mac asks, is it possible to measure or predict the speed of electron shell rotation of atoms and on the periodic table?
I think physics does have an answer to that question. Generally, it is related to our harmonic of the speed of light. There's a lot of talk about slowing down light in the right kind of atoms, but most people don't realize that time is only a name for relative spin rate. And so obviously the reason time speeds up when you accelerate is if I accelerate that photon, some of that inertia of acceleration, because of translation of vorticity, some of that acceleration will be translated into accelerated spin rate, the only definition of time. So now we know a lot better than Einstein what's meant by bending spacetime. You only mean the phenomena of the acceleration of rotation during the acceleration of mass. Mass, remember, is also only defined by the inertia stored by rotation. So anyway, this bit about bending time, it is susceptible to a much more precise language once we know what time is.
Fractal AF asks if visualizing pent is implosive and visualizing hex is stabilizing, what happens when we visualize an octagram?
Well, in physics, there are what's called symmetry groups. And the symmetry groups, tetra, octa, cube, cube octa, these are all subsets of cubic symmetry. If you made a cube, you've got two tetra in the middle. They're there already as a wave mechanics, and the octa in the center is there already. So the 7 spin symmetry axes of the tetra, the most symmetry of any object in the universe, the physics of the origin of heart muscle and the heart of the sun and hydrogen, the seven arrows to name the indigenous book. That's a symmetry group, tetra, octa, cube. In terms of wave mechanics, tetra, octa, cube always only is making square root of 2, which is a perfect way to prevent change or collapse, which is a perfect way to stabilize and is the opposite of implosive distribution. Whereas when you make a pent, cellulated pentodecaecosa, for example, the only possible 3D fractal, it is always pure golden ratio, pure charge collapse, pure implosion, pure distribution. And my famous architect friend, Gus Ciccacci, who introduced me to Bucky Fuller, his house was one rung of DNA, pent, hex, and a golden rectangle, which is one rung on the ladder of DNA. And that was his house. In the hex, you could have secrets. In the pent, you could have no secrets. And there's a usefulness to both. So nature uses cubic structures to stabilize and pent structures to distribute. And both have a service. Isn't that one isn't good or bad? But it's a fundamental nature of wave mechanics that tetracubic structures, because they only make square root of 2. And if you recall from the wave interference studies we did, square root of 2, literally the octave, creates maximum destructive wave interference, which means if anything tries to move, it's going to fall apart. It's literally dead. So that was Bucky's main point about cubes, actually. Whereas if you use golden ratio, it's maximum constructive wave interference, which is a perfect way to implode and distribute. So that oppositeness of function serves beautifully. If you want a snowflake to be stable, it's going to be hex. If you want DNA to implode, it's got to be pent. Nature uses them for opposite functions the same way witches do. Terry can wiggle in her nose, I think. I'm not sure. No, sorry.
But
Okay, this one's from Oscar. Alchemy question for Dan. When doing any sort of bliss process, let's say doing yoga at a studio inside with bad lighting, etc., will you implode the poor atmospheric conditions, electro smoke, etc.?
Well, we always say that, there are some times when you can walk on water, but generally it's easier to take a bridge. And what that means is, yes, if you need to do some bliss process in a bad place, like a metal building with electrosmog, bad air in the works, if you need to teach some kids, okay, you can, but do not expect your bliss process to be sustainable if you don't have access to nature, because when you do bliss, more and more you're imploding your environment. Very practical example. When they told Jasmine, well, we want you to prove that you can live without food, but oh, by the way, we want you to do it in this damn metal hotel room. Oh, shit. No, that's the wrong place to prove you can live without food. If you want to live without food, it's wonderful, but you got to do it in nature. The same reason Luke Skywalker couldn't raise the Jedi any other way. Anyway, hextapent. I see a question from Dan Mack there.
I didn't
Do
really.
you want to say something, Dan?
Yeah, I just like to say something, and it goes to the first part of Terry's discussion, where in alchemy, at least in my understanding, and there are several ways to turn one metal into its highest exalted state, gold. Any reference to like sulfur or mercury, while you do use acids in the process, but you're using the acid to get to the sulfur. So you're not, and it may be sulfuric acid that you're digesting something into, but then that's just one step in the process. To make the philosopher's stone, the three ways that I know that, and whether it's mercury, lead, or actual gold, you need gold, is the water, where the flame that does not consume. Another way of saying that is the water that does not wet your hand is in alchemy. If you see a picture of the wolf, especially the wolf chewing on the dead king, it is antimony. And I'm talking about the red stone, or the Caleb stone, right? That's glass. I've never been able to analyze that, but I can tell you right now, there's only two things, and it's a process, and it would be too long to talk about it here. But there are two things. One of them you turn into two, and it's antimony and gold, and you need to make glass. There's acetates involved. It's a color temperature that you go through. I mean,
Yeah.
this
I
one's
was
resting. This one's resting. I don't know if you can see this, right? This is resting. There's only two things in here. Well, there's three things, but there's only two things in here: gold and antimony. And you need to make the glass, like the kava stone, which is glass with gold in it. You need to make that, but you need to take antimony through steps.
Nice.
and then make glass out of it, and then do another step, remake more glass, and then add your, very fine, turn your gold into powder. I mean, powder, like, drop it into aqua regia and then precipitate the gold out so it's very fine powder. It becomes homogeneous. This one right now is resting, but that is, there are acids used in alchemy, but it is mercury, sulfur, and those are alchemical terms. It's not sulfuric acid. Though sulfuric acid, nitric acid are used to deconstruct something to start the process, but there's no any term is like sulfur and mercury. You're not using. Yes, you do use mercury, but you are not. It's the mercury they're talking about is not elemental mercury, though you can use mercury to make the philosopher's stone.
Yes,
Anyway,
think
that's really all I wanted to say.
Oh, it's good. You've done some serious homework here, probably more than most of us. And it is true that the nature of the flame of sulfur under the right conditions might be the perfect flame. And I would say just one other little intuition here is that it was so ironic that David Hudson's chemists, when they burnt his gold powder, never admitted to finding anything other than silicon glass, even though he had made gold. When they burnt it to do the chemical analysis, they thought it was silicon glass. And that was the gold powder. Well, why? Because the electrical geometry of silica is in the transition state too. And so the glass is a great metaphor here for the atomic structure, which has the electrical field, which then could be catalyzed under the right conditions. And that's a whole nother story. But anyway,
I could add some historical notes to what both of you have said. I mean, the word for sulfur in ancient Greek is the same as the word for divine. No one thinks it's like, the kind of what we would now call sulfur. But the reason I was talking to Dan Mack about that sulfuric acid before is because when you get into later alchemical text, you get some people saying, oh, well, that's sulfuric acid. Now, I totally agree with what you're saying. It didn't make sense to me when I think it's even the Wikipedia article on petroleum is like, oh, this is a term for sulfuric acid. I'm like, well, it's not. That doesn't make sense. And mercury, the whole introductory chapter of Jennifer Rampling's wonderful book on English alchemy is called What is Mercury? Because it's not the element mercury. I mean,
yeah, and there's so much physics there about the only one electron different than gold, but we can't do that whole conversation today. But it's a fun conversation. We have a hand raised here. Oh, sorry, Dan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Is alchemy has anything to do non-vegetarian or vegetarian or eating meat, something?
Yes. Well, the idea is that consuming life force is actually what's alchemized. So obviously anything that can't enter into the charge symmetry of implosion will inhibit that process. So essentially, to be able to recognize life force in food would be the beginning of inner alchemy. It's real. And, like a shaman would have a lucid dream the night before and have a holy communion and spear the fish the next morning, and they'd agreed in their dream to consume each other's memory. Well, that's a case where you don't need to be vegetarian. However, in general, if you want efficient implosion of life force, then you need to understand what living force in food is. Basically, because life force in food is the beginning of that implosion fusion process, which literally does transmute. That is spiritual alchemy for sure. Do we have any final questions here? We're kind of running at the end of our time. Final questions. Thank you.
Can silver ratio produce electrically effective fields geometries? How and why?
Can a single
silver ratio?
A silver ratio as opposed to golden ratio.
Right.
Yes. Well, there's lots of ways to talk about what's meant by the silver ratio. But effectively, like Fibonacci, it was a cascade which approached golden ratio. So remember, the only thing at issue here is how can waves converge non-destructively? That is the only issue, which is the problem which stumped Einstein, non-destructive compression. So the day that we proved that golden ratio is the generalized solution to constructive interference, so our view is that the silver versus gold ratio, the silver is a cascade on the cascade approach to golden ratio, exactly in the way the Fibonacci cascade is simply a caduceus to approach golden ratio, which is to say, approaching the question of perfect compression, which is the only subject of alchemy, perfect compression for sure.
Thank you. Last question from Brittany. She asks, if you live near a 5G tower and sleep in a stainless netting curtain sleeping enclosure, EMF protection, will this impact the ability for implosive energy, healing, and lucid dreaming? Is it better to be protected in the enclosure while sleeping or allow the surrounding smoke to penetrate the environment and sleeping bodies?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're in electrosmog hell, a Faraday cage can be a little bit useful. But ultimately, what you need is the natural Schumann cascade, which is to say, where Luke Skywalker went when he raised a Jed deep into nature. In other words, embedding in the Schumann cascade is the final solution. Temporarily, when you're living in hell, well, yes, get inside your Faraday cage, but don't expect the collective unconscious and ancestor memory and real bliss process to be sustainable inside your Faraday cage. No, isolation is not the goal. Ultimately, embedding is the goal. Now, admittedly, embedding ain't available in metal buildings in ugly cities, so you might need a temporary shelter, but your long-term goal is clearly embedding, not isolation, to the point where, all climactic bliss process is going to need the Schumann wind. Pyramids are called the Hummer for that reason. So if your environment has no contact with Schumann, ultimately that ain't sustainable. So yes, if you have to be in hell for a while, fine, duck, but please continue to look for nature.
A question, can she broadcast the Schumann frequency inside her cage?
Well, let me answer that this way. After Bob Beck got a little static electricity in the metal end of his Bic pen and waved it at 8 hertz in the room, and everyone in the room felt a short wave of euphoria. That wave of euphoria was short. It wasn't long. You know why? At first, when you put the pacifier suction nipple into the mouth of the baby might say, "Oh, I think there's milk," and smile. And then later, when the baby recognizes there's no milk in that nipple, that joy is not going to be sustainable. So that nipple is the shape of 8 hertz, but the milk inside is the actual phone line to the heart of Earth. And that ain't there in synthesized 8 hertz. So it's not a long-term solution. Was that a happy ever after?
Yeah, just one question left. Can you discuss the black stone more, the chemistry of the black cobblestone, if you have time?
Well, the Olmec also called their obsidian mirror a black stone, and even John Dee's scrying mirror, which was Aztec, we think, could have been called a black stone. And we think they were approximations of phase conjugate mirrors due to high dielectric material in the mirror, which is classic ancestor phone call, because a phase conjugate mirror provides the possibility of an interface to the longitudinal array, which is ancestor memory, we think. Now, the cobblestone, the story of that being molten glass with vaporized platinum group metal gold vapor in a sandwich foam, that came primarily from Vincent Bridges. And I don't think we have verification. And some people, Paul, for example, did actually not agree. So I would call that a hypothesis. It's just interesting. I think the point here is that once you understand what charge distribution perfected is, the only definition of heaven, for example, sometimes called phase conjugate dielectric, the famous paper, Alice in barium titanate land. Barium titanate is the phase conjugate dielectric, which allowed the first phase conjugate optics to make time reversal and negentropy. Well, it's just a media in which distribution is so perfected that charge can kiss noses. And actually, that is a good way to finish, I think.
Yes, we have successfully covered all questions.
Well,
Yeah, I wanted
Terry,
to thank you for having me, Dan. This was awesome. I always love to hang out here, and I'm sorry about the tech trouble, but I really enjoy hanging out with you all. So
and we enjoy your history, skill, and
yes.
knowledge. She knows everybody in Kelly's family and who they're related to. I mean, it's colorful.
Thank you both and everyone.
Thank you, everybody. So please join us next time. We'll be around next week, and stay in touch with us. We send love and light, and the FractalU project and all the projects we're working on are because of you. Thank you, Blissy.
Bye, everyone.
See you all next
Thank
week.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
It's been fun. Thanks for coming, everybody. Come and play with us again. Bye-bye.